Good evening. I'm John Atkin. I'm here with my son, Will Atkin, and we've started this little video show called The World is Our Oyster, where father and son, two different generations clearly, look at the world through two generations' eyes. We started out by talking about oysters, strangely enough, and this is our fourth show, and we've decided to use baseball stadiums that we've gone to as the basis of each show and talk about not just the stadium in that city, but also the city itself.
Yeah, and we're doing that because we've been to every stadium, right? We said that in our last show, but I think that's a big reason we're doing that too. I just wanted to make sure that that was known as well because, we have been to every baseball stadium in the country.
Yeah, minus Toronto, which of course is in Canada. And there have been a couple of new stadiums since we started our tour, but we did this for close to 15 years. We'd get to 1, 2, 3, sometimes 4 different stadiums a summer. The first stadium we visited actually was Seattle. So you can look back at last week's episode where we talk about Seattle. And this week is what we're going to call a twofer. We're doing Chicago, which has 2 stadiums, Wrigley Field and Comiskey Park.
Yep. And one of them, to me, is, one of the most iconic stadiums in baseball. And the other one is kind of a throwaway stadium. I hate to say that, but it's pretty cookie cutter, So the vast difference between these two stadiums is going to be, huge as far as how we talk about it. But is there one you want to talk about first? Do you want to do?
Well, I guess we should obviously talk about Wrigley first. It's the iconic stadium, and obviously in Chicago, but probably in the country. That and Fenway Park are both the 100-plus-year-old stadiums
in the world. How about that?
Well, maybe I don't know. Soccer stadiums or football stadiums around the world, or rugby stadiums in Australia. So I don't want to jump and say the world. But
agreed. But there's something unique and just fun about baseball stadiums. To me, I know I have the obvious bias where I love the sport, but there's something that is cool about the dimensions of a baseball stadium, and that each has its own characteristics. So I guess starting off, Wrigley, one of the great parts about Wrigley Field, they call it the friendly confines. And, I don't think I've ever felt more of like an embodiment of a phrase before, when you're in there, you really feel like it's friendly confines. It's a gem of a stadium. It's a great size. And when they built those stadiums, those old jewel box stadiums, as Wrigley is, they were small, and they actually did a ton of renovations recently too. And
renovations.
Renovations. Yeah. What did I say?
Something else. The other interesting thing about Wrigley, it was the only stadium up until 1988 that only played day games. They only had they didn't install lights until 1988, and even then there were limited night games. It was a spectacle when they'd have a night game. It was 4 or 5, maybe 10 a year. In many aspects, because the neighbors complained about the lights. But it seems
it's a pretty big deal when they first started playing night games, right? There was all sorts of like you're saying, in the community didn't like it because, you played baseball. And also there's something historic about playing all day games at Wrigley, right?
Yeah, and they never won a World Series when they did that since 19 something or other. So it was the lights and having a regular schedule rather than having to play all day games, I guess, that got them in a schedule that the rest of the major leagues were playing, and they finally did win a World Series fairly recently. And many neighbors seem to have enbraced the concept of a stadium in their neighborhood now, because a lot of the apartment buildings on the outfield, beyond the outfield walls, now have seats in them that you can look over the outside wall of the stadium and watch the game from the seats on the rooftops of the apartments.
Yeah, the Wrigley rooftops. Yeah, there was actually pretty big controversy recently with that as well, because those brand new scoreboards, they blocked a lot of those a lot of those seats. And, you're seeing this in the Fenway area too. These two historic ballparks that are building up around the location. So the Cubs actually, it's cool how they kind of have refurbished the entire stadium, because the footprint of the stadium is, if you think about the footprint of Citi Field and then you think about the footprint of Wrigley, I mean, God, I would say that Wrigley's a third of Citi Field's footprint. So they had to just kind of use the community or the neighborhood around it. And the Cubs actual clubhouse is like, if you look at like an aerial picture where it is, it's actually outside the stadium. It's out on the street there, meaning like underground, but you have to be outside the stadium to be standing on top of the clubhouse.
Do you remember what do you remember most about Wrigley walking in?
I remember that it was tiny. Usually I'm used to looking up at these giant stadiums. It was definitely on the smaller side, but there was a sense to the community around the ballpark. I think that's the biggest thing. It was, coming from our home park, Citi Field, where the Mets play. It's probably one of the more sterile environments walking in. You're literally just in a giant parking lot. This was the opposite of that, because there was, everywhere you looked, it's definitely been modernized recently, but everywhere you looked, there's a bar dedicated solely to the Cubs, or, and
I meant walking into the stadium, literally.
Oh, well, okay. So I'll keep rambling on about my experience, because then you walk in and there was a severe lack of concessions. The main idea of the whole place was to watch baseball, which is kind of a rarity in today's age. So,
well, the thing I remember most walking in is how claustrophobic I felt, because the under stands area is just very, very tight, and there are obviously hundreds and thousands of people there, and you had to really fight your way to get to the alleyway or the entrance gate to get up into your seats. I just remember feeling very claustrophobic. But then when you enter the field area, all of a sudden it takes you back in time with the ivy on the wall and the field right there, and bright green. It's sort of like a Field of Dreams feeling when you walked in. It just really struck me in that way.
Yeah, exactly that. And there's something about the outfield seating area and behind that, because like balls regularly can go out there. I mean, it's a good home run. Like, it's a long home run to hit it to left field into the street, but it's doable. So there's something like a little less major league than you're used to. Usually major leagues, like it's hard to hit the ball out of a stadium. But in Wrigley, and that contributes to the neighborhood feel of it. I mean, the fact that there's just people's houses right behind the outfield wall there is something cool. And that actually kind of brings me back to when we left. The environment after the game was second to none, as far as, it was the Cubs win. And, people are excited in the streets, just for regular season wins. So.
And the other little quirk at Wrigley, although I understand other stadiums are doing it now, including Citi Field, is if a player hits a home run into the bleachers of the opposing team, they throw the ball back. And I remember I was at a game at Citi Field, and the opposing team hit a home run right to me. And I'd never gotten the ball in all my years of going to ball games, so I quickly put it in my pocket, and everybody's looking around for it. But I didn't want to throw it back.
Yeah. I remember the guy you wrestled it from too.
Yeah.
But that was a shot, that ball. That was the Pirates, and I think they went up by like, probably went from up 10 to up 13 after that, or something like crazy. But
I don't remember the game.
I do, very specifically remembering, because I wanted to mark it down as like that was when we caught that home run ball, because it was a home run ball too, which is cool. You just get to catch those. But also, when we were at Wrigley, we went a couple times. I remember the first time we went, we actually saw Cubs Cardinals, which was a really cool rivalry, and we sat over on the first base line there. It was a cool vantage point. I loved being in the upper deck though at Wrigley, because it wasn't like a normal upper deck. It was, like I'm saying, the height of the stadium is nowhere near these modern ones.
So that's Wrigley Field, a beautiful old stadium. We both appreciated all of its charm and ivy and throwing the home run balls back and all that stuff.
Yeah,
And down on the south side of town is Kaminsky Park. I think it's now called Guaranteed Rate Field or
great
some
name.
corporate name. And, frankly, it was a little nondescript as we approached it and even got in it.
Yeah. I think they've tried to make it a little better recently with like adding some bars in the outfield as you do. But from my perspective, it was pretty cookie cutter, not just because the dimensions are very straightforward, but there was nothing exceptional about it. I mean, the the character of baseball. I mean, you just said it with Wrigley, the ivy and the friendly confines. There's a lore to that I didn't really feel a guaranteed rate field, which I
Yeah.
guess if you're talking about it, you don't expect to.
Well, the other fun thing about Kaminsky, we were a little late getting there. We had actually driven in that day from Milwaukee because we were up there seeing the Brewers Stadium, and so we ended up getting caught in traffic. And I think we got in on the first or second inning. But the plus of going to a stadium where not a lot of people go is we got front row seats. We're
Yeah.
right behind first base, and that's always fascinating to watch a baseball game that close up.
Yeah, right down the first base line. I think that's one of the first times we've sat like field level that close. It was definitely, I remember it pretty well just being that close to professional athletes it's a different experience, especially as a kid like me that was playing baseball,
Hmm.
getting to see these like real, like the top of the game really close was really cool. But like you're there for baseball, but you also want to see, a great stadium. And I don't think, to me, in my opinion, at least, as far as the other stadiums in comparison, this didn't really live up to anything great.
Yeah. Well, there are 32 whatever major league stadiums. They're all not going to be great,
Yeah, but this
and
one in particular, for
it
whatever
was
reason,
pretty
like
pretty plain,
pretty bland.
pretty bland, pretty plain. So what we do normally in our shows is after we talk about the stadium in this new series, we talk a little bit about the city, and then we always have a top five list of what attracts us about, in this case, Chicago. We don't tell each other what we're going to say ahead of time. But we did spend a little time walking through Chicago, Michigan Avenue, South Wacker Street, and the Sears Tower. I know you really liked going out to the Navy Pier, if I recall.
Yeah, the Navy Pier was fun. That out in Lake Michigan, like you don't get an idea of how big these lakes are until you're on one, and it's crazy that it's like, oh, that's all fresh water out there. Wow. So and it freezes in the winter. Like, to me, that was a crazy concept as a kid from the Northeast. Um, but no, I mean, Chicago's a beautiful city. It's right on the lake. One of my favorite parts about that area, just south of the Navy Pier, there is actually Soldier Field. We never
Mhm.
got to go inside of it, but the as an architecture buff, driving through Chicago is fun. But I don't know if I can call myself necessarily an architecture buff, but I like architecture. And driving by that stadium, I was like, wow, that's an NFL stadium. And yeah, Soldier Field was really cool to drive
Yeah, they modernized it, and then we took a boat ride up the Chicago River on an architecture tour where they
by.
showed
Yeah,
a lot of the buildings, everything from the old Wrigley building to the newer skyscrapers along the Chicago River. Um, and we actually stayed in an old hotel right overlooking the Chicago River. When we were there, it's now called Club Quarters, but at the time it was called something else. I can't remember what the original name was. We also went to the part of the deal when I took Will to these cities and the stadiums, was we had to do either a cultural and or a natural uh, uh, nature
activity.
outdoor activity as well. We did spend some time in the Art Institute of Chicago, if I recall, and looking at some of the artwork there. I remember going to a second museum, and I can't remember which one it was. But a lot of culture in Chicago, a lot of things to see. After all, it is the nation's second or third largest city. So
Yeah.
uh, you know, uh, I don't know, 7, 8 million people. I'm guessing live in the metro area, so there's a lot of activities when you get to Chicago.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things we do is at the end of every show is give a top five list. And so it's probably appropriate that our top five list has to do with Chicago this time. Top five things you've seen or remind you of Chicago, or, just top five Chicago things. Do you want to go first this week?
Sure. I went first last week,
Oh, you
so
did.
why
Then
don't
I
you go
guess I go
first?
first. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Top five. We were just talking about and these all come with a little explanation. We're talking about the Art Institute of Chicago. One of my favorite American artists, a guy named Edward Hopper, and he did most of his painting is in New York City. One of the more famous ones is called Nighthawks. It's of four people sitting in an all-night diner in the middle of Manhattan. And there was a Hopper exhibit at the Whitney Museum in New York a couple of years ago, and Nighthawks wasn't there because it was in Chicago, and they wouldn't let it leave Chicago to come to the Edward Hopper exhibit. So my number five is Nighthawks. It's my favorite Hopper.
That's the one where they're all at the bar, right? And
They're
you're
all at it's a diner
diner,
bar.
yeah,
Yeah,
diner
yeah,
bar, and you're looking through the window. It's very
right.
distinct. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I've actually written a couple of short stories based on it. I'm sure not what Hopper had in mind when he wrote it, but um, so that's my number five. Number four is Chicago's two stadiums. We're just talking about it, but I love the fact that Chicago's a two major league town. So that's number four. I mean, New York is obviously the number one two major league town, and then you have LA/Anaheim. But
I think they're LA now. They've
Yeah, but they're in Anaheim.
no, I know.
Uh, but the fact that it's a two major league town. We talked about the stadiums. We love Wrigley. We're kind of meh about Kaminsky, but it's a major league stadium, and we've got to them all, so we want to talk about them. Number three is the elevated railroad that brings people in from the outskirts, all the way from the airports, and then the area in downtown Chicago called the Loop, where the elevated line, wraps around and heads back in the other direction. And I think about up until the 40s, before I was born, but New York had all kinds of L's, and now all our subways are underground. When I
So
get
sorry to interrupt, but the L, so that means like it's obviously the L stands for loop, right? Like,
No, the L stands for
uh,
elevated.
oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, yeah,
So and that's like synonymous with Chicago. When I see those I mean, there's some in New York still, but
yeah. There are some on the outskirts of it, but none
yeah,
in Manhattan anymore. You get
yeah,
out the 7 line out to City Field is elevated,
right.
but it's not. It's not like before. It was almost literally up against buildings.
Right. Right.
There's
Well, and that when you get to Wrigley, there's that you're on an elevated
yeah, yeah,
train in
yeah,
some way. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's number three.
And
Number
then
two,
really
yeah.
quick, I'm sorry, but and then inside that loop also, that's like a big retail space, right?
Well, they're
Because
buildings. I mean, the loop is goes down one street and wraps around and comes
right
up
in
in front.
downtown, but isn't there like a big retail district amongst all that
Yeah,
or
I imagine, and
yeah.
offices and restaurants.
Just
I
'cause
don't.
I'm just kind of saying that that's kind of a central hub
Hmm.
to Chicago. I just think
Yeah,
that's
they call it. It's sort of one of the downtown areas, and they call it the Loop,
gotcha.
because the elevated is loops in that area.
Right.
I believe. I may be
Not
making all that up.
no, that's true.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
we both agree on that, so it must be true.
Okay, yeah. But we might have somebody from Chicago that's watching this and says you guys are totally wrong.
Yeah, maybe.
My number two is the Sears Tower, which is now for some reason called the Willis Tower. Um, I think it for a long time in the 70s and 80s after it was built, it was the tallest building in the world. It's now the third tallest in the U.S. And But going up to the top of that, and the view is just incredible and scary. And if you're an agoraphobe, stay away from the edge. It's pretty scary up there.
Does an
The
agoraphobe
interesting,
does an agoraphobe mean afraid of heights?
I think so.
Okay.
And then I was also remember that when it was the Sears Tower, and I think people probably in Chicago probably still call it the Sears Tower. Um, the first, I don't know how many floors out of the 100 floors were still occupied by Sears when it was before it went bankrupt. May still be, I don't know. And they called that section of the tower the catalog, which I just think is funny
Yeah,
because
that's funny.
Sears came in a catalog as well as retail stores. But my number one thing in Chicago is the Bean, which is this sculpture that was um, commissioned back in the early 2000s. Um, I think it was actually a British sculptor. That's probably a 75 or 100 foot, maybe by 20 or 30 feet tall bean. It looks like a kidney bean, very high silver shine on it. And you see reflections. You look up at it, you see yourself upside down in one place, other places, you see other people upside down. You can see the reflections of all the buildings and lights at night. And it's just become this huge tourist attraction in Millennium Park in Chicago. So that's um, my number one thought for Chicago. How about you?
So is that the purpose of it? Is that to take pictures? Like the reflectiveness is? I never thought about that. That's interesting. So yeah, because you do often see, when you look up into it, there's like a distorted image that comes
Yeah,
back. That's cool.
I I mean it's art. It's just a piece of sculpture, and you
Mhm.
can think of it however you want.
Oh
So
yes.
I remember looking at it and looking at myself upside down. You move a few feet, and all of a sudden you're right side up, but your
Yeah.
cheeks are out to here. So
And you get that classic picture of you taking a picture of yourself looking
right,
into it and then strangers surrounding you. Cool.
exactly. So what are your top
S-
five?
So my top five. So I went a little general with my fifth one. Number five is just the overall like architecture. I was kind of talking about it with Soldier Field.
Mhm.
There's a theme of architecture. I mean, we took that architecture tour um, down the river there, and that river is so cool because you got side by side skyscrapers next to you. And I don't think I've ever experienced something like that in a city before, where you get to travel on a river through a giant metropolitan city. So just the overall architecture and construction of Chicago is my number five. Um, Number four stands alone, just Soldier Field. One of the cooler stadiums I've ever seen. I didn't actually even get to go inside it, but the fact of how they refurbished it and made it a modern NFL stadium is just amazing to me. They kind of put they took in one of those really old, almost like LA Coliseum type of stadiums and just plopped all the modern things on top of it.
Mhm.
So there's actually parts of the stadium still that some of those very like narrow, shallow stairways that used to be in those old stadiums, that is still like parked behind all these modern
Mhm.
new things, new features. So I just thought that's cool because I love seeing how things are constructed and stuff like that. Um, Number three is Lollapalooza, and I think this is because I've watched some videos of bands that I've liked, like you search live videos and you see them playing, but I also just love the proximity to the lake there. This huge festival in what's the park? It's in that same park, I believe.
Millennium Park. Yeah.
Yeah, Millennium Park there, and I think we were there. It was either that or some other type of festival that was set up, but it was gigantic. I couldn't believe how far I was from the stage, but also still could hear the sound check that was happening a good couple 100 feet away.
Mhm.
So just thinking about the immenseness of that festival was really cool, and it's on my bucket list of things to go to. Number two is the some of the people that have come out of Chicago. I don't know. I'm sure there are definitely people I'm going to leave off this list, but people like Robin Williams, Chance the Rapper, Obama. There's some really like unbelievably like creative and influential people that have just pushed things forward. I looked up a whole list of people from Chicago, and for whatever reason, I don't know why, but I've just noticed that there's some really interesting, influential people that come out of the city of Chicago. So that's my number two. And my number one, this won't happen often, but my number one is Wrigley Field. I mean, I don't think I'd rather go watch a baseball game in any other place, even over Boston. There's something just, I keep saying it, but the friendly confines, it's a real thing. It's that's where baseball was meant to be played. I understand why they tried to keep night games out forever, because that's one of the few places in this country where baseball hasn't really been touched for over 100 years. And yeah, and so Wrigley is hard to beat for me. It kind of embodies Chicago to me.
Cool. Well, I had both stadiums, or the both baseball teams, in my top 5 too. So
Yeah,
um,
that's the first time we've overlapped. I'm surprised.
yeah,
It took us this long.
So so that's our show for today. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, put them below. If you have any disagreements on our top 5, or you want to add some, go ahead. If you have a city you want us to talk about that we've been to, let us know. And Will, you said something about subscribing.
Yeah, and if you want to put your own top 5 down there, please, by all means. Yeah, so just go ahead and like and subscribe as well. Turn on those notifications, because that's kind of what keeps you coming back. You'll see us keep reappearing if you like what you hear. But only do if you like it, or if you're hate watching us, that's fine too.
Right.
Yeah, it was a fun show, Dad. And next week we're gonna do probably another city, and walk down memory lane as we have it.
And sometimes we argue a bit more than we did this time, so make sure you stay tuned for the next one, because we are 2 different generations and we don't always agree.
That's right.
So say goodnight, Will.
Good night. Good night, Dad.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye.